Listen carefully to the next two chapters, everybody, as I will be requiring you to draw me a little image and I want you to label it, please. I also then want you to predict what you think will happen in the next few chapters after these. Here we go, chapter 2. The caravan air was thick with the stench of sweat and rotting wood. Wild Boy hung by hairy fingertips from the hatch in the roof, his bare feet groping for the ladder on the wall. Not finding it, he let go and landed with a thud that shuddered the van and made the ceiling lamp sway on its hook. "Ha, caught you," a voice said. Wild Boy whirled round, fearing it was Finch, but it was just the showman's assistant, Sir Oswald Farley. "Master Wild," said Oswald, "Mr. Finch would not be pleased were he to catch you sneaking around outside." Wild Boy grinned. He'd lived with Sir Oswald for 3 years, but still found it funny to hear his posh voice. "The old goat's got to catch me first," he said. Sir Oswald muttered something disapproving as he helped Wild Boy up with one hand, his other pressed hard against the floor. Sir Oswald had no legs. Instead, he got onto his hands, which were as tough and leathery as his wrinkled old face. But, despite his disability, he always looked immaculate in his tailcoat, top hat and tie. There wasn't a speck of dirt on his face, a rare achievement in a place as filthy as a travelling fair. "I wish you would not take such risks," he fussed. It was a risk Wild Boy knew. Augustus Finch didn't allow him to go outside between shows, but it was worth it. The less time he spent in his van, the better. He didn't mind the smell or the constant cold or even the rainwater that leaked through wormholes in the roof. It was the stage that he hated, the upturned crates and the tatty red cloth for a curtain. Propped beside them against the wall was a rusty camp bed with a strip of cloth hung between its legs. Its painted slogan read, "Deep in the jungle, terror awaits." Sir Oswald rushed to the stage, his strong upper body swinging between his hands as his coattails dragged him along the floor. He hoisted himself onto the crate and hid behind the curtain. "Quickly, Master Wild," he said. Wild Boy hesitated, glancing up at the hatch in the roof. He wished that he could climb back outside and hide there all day, watching the crowds. He wished he could do anything other than this, the sort of things that normal people did. It was the same dream he had had before every show, but he knew it was just a cruel fantasy. He wasn't normal. He was a freak. This was where he belonged. "Just get on with it," he whispered. He rushed to the stage and joined Sir Oswald behind the curtain. Getting ready didn't take long. Apart from his breeches, Wild Boy wore only one item of clothing, a long red drummer boy's coat with gold tassels, which he'd stolen from a marching band last year. For the show, he simply unbuttoned it so the audience could see more of the hair all over his body. "Master Wild," said Oswald, "look at this hair, such a state, all this dirt and mud, and is that horse dung? Don't you ever wash?" It was horse dung, Wild Boy knew, and he never washed. Partly because there wasn't much opportunity. Clean water was rare at most sites where the travelling fair pitched. But, more than that, he didn't think there was much point. "Why bother?" he said. "Why bother? Manners for a start, young man." "Monsters don't have manners," Wild Boy said with a grin. "Monsters indeed," Sir Oswald said, brushing the long tangled hair on Wild Boy's chest. Wild Boy stepped suddenly back. A bolt of anger shot through him, and his hands curled into fist. "Don't touch me!" he snapped. Sir Oswald slid away, staring at the marks he'd seen on the pallid skin beneath Wild Boy's hair. Old scars from the workhouse's master's belt and from all the fights there with the other boys. Wild Boy messed his hair up again, hiding the marks. He hadn't meant to shout at Sir Oswald. He just didn't like being touched, and those scars were the reason. Dark memories came creeping from the place at the back of his mind where he kept them hidden. But he forced them back again and sniffed. "They ain't nothing," he said. Sir Oswald looked at him, the wrinkles on his face easing away. "Master Wild," he said softly, "I apologise." "They ain't nothing, Sir Oswald. Besides, I'm a monster, remember?" Sir Oswald smiled, although his eyes stayed sad. Wild Boy could tell that his friend wanted to ask more about the scars and his past life in the workhouse. But he didn't want to talk about it. He couldn't. Eager to change the subject, he forced a smile of his own and stepped closer. "You say I ain't a monster, eh? How about this then?" Alarm flashed across Sir Oswald's face. "No, Master Wild, don't." Grabbing him under the arms, Wild Boy lifted him into the air. "Roar!" he joked. "I'm a savage monster. I'm half boy, half bear, and half wolf and all. I already ate your legs, and now I'll have the rest of you." Sir Oswald wriggled in his grass, trying to fight a grin. "Master Wild, if you do not unhand me this instant, I shall be forced to clip your ear." Wild Boy set him carefully back on stage. He knew that Sir Oswald wasn't really angry. His friend understood what it was like to look different to other people. Years ago, Sir Oswald had been the star of Finch's freak show, billed as Little Lord Handyman. He'd performed tricks on his hands as he told stories of how he'd lost his legs at the Battle of Waterloo. But since then, people had lost their appetite for heroes. Now they had a taste for monsters. Sir Oswald looked through a hole in the stage curtain. "Here they come," he warned. The caravan door opened and Augustus Finch led an audience inside. The showman moved among them, listening to their coins clink into his tin. 6 clinks. Finch's face cracked into a satisfied sneer. He slicked back his greasy black hair and white hair to show off his collection of scars. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "the tale I'm about to tell you is truly shocking." No, it ain't, Wild Boy thought. The only shocking thing was how long Finch had been telling it. The showman gave the same patter before every show, a tale about the creature Wild Boy, who was raised in a forest by bears. But Wild Boy didn't mind the story. After all, it sounded a nicer way to grow up than in his old workhouse. And besides, it gave him a few minutes to spy on the audience. He peered through the curtain hole, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. "Do you see anything interesting?" Sir Oswald whispered. "Don't see nothing," Wild Boy said. "Poppycock, you see everything, Master Wild." Although he pretended not to understand, Wild Boy knew he did see things differently to others. All those hours he'd spent staring through his workhouse window, searching for clues to the world outside, the world he dreamed of being part of. From tiny details on people's faces and clothes, he'd learned to paint whole pictures of their lives. It had become instinctive. He read people like code. Not that there was much to see about this mob. Steam rose from their thick coats, and even from behind the curtain he could smell the booze on their breath. One man had bruised knuckles. One woman had sick on her chin. Except the priest, Wild Boy whispered. At the back of the audience was a priest. That wasn't unusual. Priests often visited fairs to preach to people about their sins. Only Wild Boy could tell immediately that this man was an imposter. He closed his eyes and thought about the priest he'd watched around the camps. Sometimes, when he remembered things, it was as if the images were frozen in his head. He could study them like they were paintings framed on a wall. He visualised one priest, then another. Both men had scuffs on their trouser knees from praying and soot on their fingers from snuffing out candles. This man, though, had neither of these things. He did have a dog collar that looked like it was made of newspaper, specifically the Morning Chronicle, a Bible that had barely been opened, judging from the lack of wear on the spine, and a sheen of nervous sweat glistening above his upper lip. What kind of man pretends to be a priest in a crowd? Wild Boy wondered. The answer revealed itself a second later when he saw the man's hand dip into a lady's shawl and, fast as a flash, remove a purse. He was a pickpocket. "Positions, Master Wild," Sir Oswald said as he hid behind the propped-up bed next to the sage. "Here we go." A crazy idea entered Wild Boy's head. He tried to push it away, but it wormed its way back, growing fat with possibility. What if he saved one of these people from the thief? Would they thank him? Better still, would they take him away from this place to a new life? Maybe it wasn't such a fantasy. "Master Wild," Sir Oswald whispered, "are you quite well? You are shaking." Wild Boy turned. Wide eyes stared at his friend. "Sir Oswald, do you think people like us could be anything else?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, something other than freaks." Sir Oswald slid from behind the bed, although his face remained hidden in shadow. He lowered his voice. Wild Boy had never heard him sound so serious. "Master Wild, I do think that. But whatever makes you ask me this now?" It's nothing. You better hide." Sir Oswald looked reluctant to abandon the conversation, but he heard the showman's speech coming to an end and disappeared back behind the bed. "Gather in close," Finch cried. "Gather in and get a good gulp. Prepare yourselves for the most hideous, most revolting, most sickeningest sight in all of England. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the savage spectacle of Wild Boy." With a flourish of his hand, the showman yanked away the curtain. The act had been the same ever since Wild Boy joined the freak show, and they performed it up to 20 times a day at these large fairs, so he knew it well. As the curtain fell, he should have been snarling like a dog and chewing an old bone at the side of the stage. But this time, he just stood, staring, lost in increasingly excited thoughts. The crowd didn't care. They'd just come to see a freak, and Wild Boy certainly fitted that description. The group huddled closer, their mouths puckered in delighted disgust. "Ugly bugger," one of them said. "Looks like a baby werewolf. Ugh, or a stinking armpit." Wild Boy tried not to listen. He heard the same jokes every day, and dozens much more cruel. At the workhouse, he'd always fought back against boys who teased him, which meant he'd got into a lot of fights. Eventually, he'd been locked up alone in that cell. When he joined the travelling show, he'd done the same, leaping from the stage, punching and spitting at anyone who yelled abuse. But these weren't boys in a workhouse. Here, the bullies were a lot tougher. Most nights during these first few months, Wild Boy hadn't been able to sleep from the pain of his bruises. He'd been lucky though. Plenty of punters at fairs carried knives, clubs, and even garroting wires. It wouldn't have been long before he punched the wrong person. So he'd made a new rule. As long as no one touched him, he'd put up with the teasing. This was a freak show, and he was a freak, after all. He hoped that, eventually, he'd become dumb to the names or not even hear them. But he still did. And even after all this time, they still stung. That afternoon, though, his attention was focused entirely on the thief as he watched the man swipe another purse and then a pocket watch from a fob. There was only one person he hadn't yet robbed, an old man at the front of the small group. Wild Boy studied the man and, in seconds, knew that he was a retired soldier, an opium addict, was heavily in debt, and that he had come to the fair to gamble the last of his pennies at the card tables. The clues were obvious enough. the red-brown tinge to the man's teeth caused by smoke from the opium pipe, and the slight tremble of his hands from withdrawal were clear indications of the man's addiction. The sprig of heather in his pocket suggested that he'd visited one of the gypsies at the park gates, a sign of both desperation and concern for his immediate fortunes. And as for the man's military past and current debt problem, Wild Boy could see that he'd once worn medals on his coat. The darker patch on his lapel, unfaded by the sun, showed where they'd been displayed. But the pinholes didn't look torn, so the medals hadn't been ripped up by thieves. More likely, they'd been sold, and only the most desperate of men would trade the trophies he'd once worn so proudly. All of this was brilliant news to Wild Boy. Surely the man would be even more grateful than most were he to have his last penny saved from the fingers of a pickpocket. Wild Boy wondered if the man would give him a job. He'd happily work for free as a servant. Maybe he could have a real name, something like a normal life. Eventually, perhaps the old gentleman would adopt him as a son, like in the plays they staged at some of the fairs. By now, Wild Boy was so excited that he forgot to breathe, and he coughed. The old gentleman stepped back, closer to the thief's probing hand. How could Wild Boy warn him? He had to be polite, he decided, to show the man that he wasn't a monster. He'd learned a few posh words from Sir Oswald that might do the trick. But he needed to act fast before the pickpocket struck. Now! He jumped from the stage and landed with a thump beside the old man. "Good sir," he said, "may I be so bold as to offer a word of—" "Monster!" The old man screamed in fright, stepped back and thrashed Wild Boy with his cane. Wild Boy reacted without thinking, first punching the man in the nose and then shoving him back into the pickpocket. "Don't you bloody touch me!" he yelled. In a rush of panic, he tried to scramble up onto the stage, but the old man grabbed his long hair and yanked him back. Wild Boy turned and lashed out again, swearing and whirling his fists. But now the others joined in against him too. A woman kicked his shin. Someone else punched his jaw. "Get off me!" he cried. "There's a thief!" "He says he's a thief! Get him to the ground, bloody freaks!" One of them stamped on Wild Boy's bare foot and he tumbled over. He curled up as they surrounded him, raining blows. Augustus Finch hopped excitedly round the scene. "1 penny for a kick! Pay up, pay up! Anyone that kicks him owes me a penny!" And then they were gone, a crush of limbs squeezing for the door. The showman skipped behind them, calling to the punters who had gathered outside. Hear what they say about Wild Boy. He's wild, he's wonderful, and you can kick him for a penny." Wild Boy rolled over, groaning and muttering obscenities. Every part of his body ached. But more than that, he felt angry. Not at the old gentleman, but at himself. "You idiot," he muttered. Then he yelled so loud that it shook the ceiling lamp on its hook. "Bloody idiot freak!" He lay on the floor, anger coursing through his veins. He wanted to scream even louder, to burst up and kick the caravan walls until he'd smashed this whole van into pieces. But he knew it would do no good. This was his life. If not this freak show, then another one. Sir Oswald appeared from behind the bed. "Whatever was that about, old chap?" "Nothing," Wild Boy muttered. "Just a stupid idea." They looked at each other for a moment, and he knew that Sir Oswald understood. His friend smiled at him sadly as he helped him up from the floor. "Come on," he said. "Better get ready for the next lot." Okay, see if you can just draw me a picture and label it to show me that you've understood what happened in that chapter.